to tithe or not to tithe? That is the question. Today on Life Talks, Dan and I are going to do a friendly little debate, and we're going to talk about money.
I love this format because in this format, we may or may not be taking positions that we truly believe in our heart or that we're still working through. This one, I'm pretty confident on, and that's why I staked out the position that I have. Mm-hmm. But and so we kind of warn our listeners up front that we're trying to look at both sides of the angle for the purpose of education.
Yes.
So you can draw your own conclusions at the end of the broadcast.
Yeah. So this was a topic that we thought, sometimes there are debates that we do that would pit, Christian versus non-Christian. This is kind of an internal debate, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to take the position of the non-tithing position.
Yeah, and by non-tithing, you'd simply say that tithing is an Old Testament concept that's not necessary for the church today.
Correct.
Which is not an unusual position for some in the evangelical.
Yes, and you're taking the position of
that the tithe is still a guiding principle for the New Testament believer.
Okay. Well, I'm going to let you go first, Dan. I'm going to throw it out to you. Give me your best arguments why Christians should tithe today.
All right. Well, it begins with the idea that an acknowledgement that we are under grace, we're not under the law.
Okay.
So we are not under an obligation for our salvation, mm-hmm. for keeping the law, whether that is the Ten Commandments or tithe or whatsoever. However, I would note that under this age of grace in which we find ourselves now, which is kind of a dispensational term, but I think we understand under the New Testament, New Covenant, that that the expectations do not decrease, but rather increase. And for instance, in the Old Testament is thou shalt not commit adultery. In the New Testament, Jesus said, look, if you're looking after a woman and you got lust in your heart, it's like you committed adultery.
Right.
In the Old Testament, it is thou shalt not murder. And in the New Testament, it says, if you hate somebody in your heart, it's like you've murdered them. So there is a higher standard in the New Testament than the Old Testament. And I would contend that applies to tithing.
Okay.
That in tithing, the minimum standard in the Old Testament is the first fruits, which would be 10%. Mm-hmm. So if you made $1, you gave a dime. If you had 100 bushels of wheat, you gave 10 bushels of wheat. Mm-hmm. And it was the first 10. It was the priority 10. It was the best 10. And so I would contend that under that same principle of priority and first fruits, that in the New Testament, we begin with the tithe, but that also there is an expectation, and we see it repeatedly in Scripture, that we give because of grace. So tithing is the beginning point, but if we have more than we need and we keep it, we're then guilty of greed, that we should be willing to share it. And so 10% is the starting point, but for many of us, particularly in this generation and in this country and in this economy, 10% may be disobedience for us when we can look around us and we have more than we need, and we look around us and see needs for others. But that first 10% was that benchmark that calls us to having God as a priority, being proportional, and also, just the obedience to the standard. The other thing that I would add to this is that even Jesus himself reaffirmed the tithe, because if you'll remember when Jesus was watching the offerings taking place, you remember that people making a big fanfare, and the little one brought her mites. Right. But he mentioned, he said, some have been giving their tithe as they ought. So it said, he didn't say, and some are giving their tithe and they're really wasting their time, or I'm here to put away that. But no, he said, no, giving the tithe is the good thing, but then taking it, she went beyond the tithe. She gave all that she had, and he commended that. So there was that faith measure, that added measure of generosity, that he not only affirmed the tithe, but he blessed the sacrifice. And then probably my final argument would be this, is, and man, I have been slaughtered on the internet if I ever have written articles in the past.
It's so unlike the internet.
Regularly. Yeah, but by people who seem to kind of troll looking for articles on tithing and then just launch on how it's legalistic and how it's manipulative, and obviously I'm a pastor.
Guess what? I was one of those people, Dan.
Were you really?
No.
But my response back to that is, I'm not your priest. I'm a pastor. You will stand before God for how you respond. But I just want you to, would you mind sharing with me how you'll stand before a God who gave his first fruits, gave his best to us.
Gave 100%.
Gave 100%, and say to him, I couldn't give a dime of every dollar. And in fact, it would have been wrong for me to do so because that was legalism. Explain to me how you're going to share that with the Lord. So, and I've got other arguments, but those
all
are my
right.
big
So
three.
good start, Dan. I'll give you points.
Go ahead and concede.
I'll give you points. So here's what I would say, and again, I'm not. My point in being anti-tithe is not saying that we shouldn't give. What I would say is, if you understand the way the tithe was used in the Old Testament, you have to go back to the cultural moment that it was in, and is the Israelite nation and people group was a theocracy, okay? And so what we understand is that in our world that we live in, there is a definite separation of powers. There is a wall between church and state, right? Mm-hmm. So there's no mingling between government and religion. That was not true with the people of God and the people of Israel. And so most of their tithe went to two different things. It went, there's actually 3 tithes that they talk about in the Old Testament, and 2 of them were annual. So it was actually 10% plus another 10%, and there's another third tithe that they would collect every 3 years. So it was about 23 1/3% annual, what we'd consider, religious taxation. But those went to things like feeding the Levitical tribes and priesthood and clothing them and the running of the temple and some of the government offices. So there was this complete mixture of both government and religion and everything, and the people gave out of that, and that was the tithe. It was almost like it was /giving/tax. That's what it was. And so I think when you add something, that a stipulation that was required, I think it's something that, though it was good, and even you said Jesus mentioned that what they ought, because they were still before his death, they were under the law. So I think the thing that I would say is the tithe what comes with the tithe is almost an obligatory giving that I don't think Jesus wants us to do. I think what Jesus wants us to do is to give out of this sense of abundance. He wants us to give out of love. You mentioned grace. I believe grace is it. I think that so that's what I would say. That the word tithe comes with too much baggage, and it's too much historical context of it doesn't apply today. The second thing I would say is this: I believe the danger of the tithe is that it has kept too many people from giving spiritually. And the reason why, what they do is kids that were taught give a 10 cents out of every dollar, which is great. What I think it does is it can prohibit people from actually giving more. You and I both grew up in great families where our parents taught us to give and to give generously. In fact, my dad taught me that if the Old Testament required 10%, then any believer should give definitely more than 10%. Like that was his interpretation of it. Like that's the baseline, and you could go above that. What I would say is that I think there's far too many people who, move the decimal over, write a check, or put in their, bill pay, and it's not an act of worship. It's not an act of genuineness. It is tradition. It is go through the motions, and when you do that, you're not really teaching people how to worship God from a giving stature. There's nowhere in any of Paul's letters, in any of John's letters, in any of Peter's letters, all of whom grew up in Second Temple Judaism, who understood the Old Testament law, James, not one of them mentions the tithe. What they do mention is giving generously, giving, that giving is important and it's appropriate, but they don't mention the tithe at all. And so I would say is it actually prohibits people from giving spiritually and worshipfully. That's what I got, Dan. Right. Take that. Yeah. Britt, who won the first round? Come on, man.
Well, wait until I dismantle some of what he just said. If you would.
Come on.
So I would suggest that I think the whole notion that emphasizing the tithe creates a limited mindset to people who give is completely bogus. Because
why? Don't you think that? Don't you think?
Absolutely not, and I'm evidence of it. I mean, if we're going to use anecdotal evidence, then I'll just use me. So.
Man, do I know someone who this happened to?
Yeah. Well, and here's the thought. I know of a lot of people who are anti-tithe, and most of them feel like giving $5 on a Sunday is generous, and quite honestly, they have less problem buying a movie ticket than they would putting the $5 in the offering plate when it goes by, if their church takes the offering. And in other words, it's almost a lackadaisical. And I believe there's a discipline to giving that is important, in as much as there's a discipline that is part of our whole biblical journey. I would say that the same argument then could be applied to praying over your food. I don't pray over food because it's magical. I pray over food because it forces me to consider that moment where I sit before the bounty that God has placed before me, and requires that I at least make some kind of attempt to acknowledge that God is good and gracious in giving me this. And so when I'm giving, again, that is. And I believe in this, and this will make me even more radical. I believe the first fruits means before taxes. So when I give off my gross, not my net. People ask me all the time.
You're a gross giver.
I'm a gross giver. People ask me all the time, well, should I give before or after taxes? Should I give before or after Social Security and all these other things? And I think you're asking the wrong questions. The question is not how little should I give, but how much can I give?
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean, I'm not poor. and I work 2 jobs, but I'm certainly not poor.
Yeah.
But the reality is you'll live better on 90% spent with thought than you will on 100% spent without thought. And I think it's anecdotal, but most of us will give evidence that is true, because when you're thoughtful before God, all the other things do. I think praying, I think attending church once a week on Sunday morning, the first day of the week, is it legalistic, or is it a part of our discipline?
Well, I think every and any discipline can become legalistic.
Yeah,
right?
Thoughtlessly. Yeah.
Right? So I think one of the things that we have to be very careful of is we have to become aware that any discipline that we adopt into our lives and become very good at it can become a legalistic standard. Right? You would agree with that.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think giving with the intent of getting something back, and I've heard this preached for years from Bible preachers that say, if you want God to be generous to you, you must be generous to him. I don't give with the expectation that God is going to be generous with me in the future. He's already been generous to me in the past. I'm not giving because it bought my redemption. I'm giving out of a symbolic acknowledgement that he owned it all in the first place, and he's letting me keep 90%. I'm also just cognizant of the fact that he owns everything, and it's a way of honor and tribute to him. But this idea that we only do things because there's something in it for us, I think is outside of what God wants us to do.
I would agree with that, and I think that's really one of the things. What I would say, if I was in the position of anti-tithe, I would say, instead of coming up with a number, just again, blanket 10% doing it, what I would say is bring the fullness, the 100% before the Lord, and say, you and your spouse come up and say, what God, what do you want us to give? What is it that would be generous? What would be extravagant? What would be an act of worship and an act of trust to you? Because I think if we did that, I think people would give more than 10%. I think that was one of the things, like, I know of people that they were giving 10% and they wanted to challenge their faith in God. And what they started to do is every year they started adding a percentage point. And then they year by year, every year they just start, I'm going to uptick it one more time just to see. And to me, that's a really good thing. I think the danger, again, I'm going to go back to default to, I think the person who just gives, and I know we're talking about 13% of the church. Right?
Right.
And again, I'm not saying that of Life Fellowship. It could be true of Life Fellowship.
Generally speaking, 80% of the money is given by 20%.
We know based on the recent studies that have come out, only 13% of regular churchgoers give tithe on a regular basis. 13%. That's 1 out of every 8. Okay, so that's pretty significant. You're talking about 87% of the people who that come to church are involved in church, but don't give regularly to the church. And to me, what I would hope to do is that people would begin to start. And here's the thing: what I would say is, if you feel like, man, 10%, I just can't do it, it's just too big, then start with 1%, and then every year challenge yourself to go to another. Start somewhere. Don't just, if 10% is too big of a leap of faith for you, then find some number that is a test of faith, and let that be your starting point, but keep pushing that faith in Christ to show you that he's going to take care of you, right? I mean,
I'd probably take a little a little different view on that. I would say start with the 10% and increase it from there, simply because I do believe it is a matter of obedience and showing priority. Again, for him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. And so I would say start at the 10 and increase, but I do think that incremental approach is a good thing. I just wouldn't say, you know what, Lord, I'm only going to lie on one day of the week, or I'm going to go one day a week without lying, or, you know, some other issue of obedience that to me that doesn't seem to be, you know.
Do you think if people don't tithe, they're sinning?
I do.
Wow, that was really fast.
Yeah,
you didn't even
because
think
again,
about
I go back to the scripture. For him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. And here's the other thing that I think is tragic. And by the way, I'm guilty of plenty of sins too. So if you're all offended because I said you're sinning because
Dan thinks you're all sinners anyways.
And again, I am not your priest. So you will stand before God.
We're all sinners.
Yeah, exactly. But I would say, think of the tragedy of this. Okay, so because I deal with numbers a lot here, right? So 13% of the typical church, born-again evangelical Christian is giving.
Yes.
And some give more, but 13% are tithing. And of that 13% that goes to the typical church, 50% of it is spent on staff, payroll, and those kind of things. And of the remaining 50%, of that amount, it's
certain percentage goes to buildings,
60% or 30% of the overall budget. So that leaves you with 20%. 20% does everything from pay for the bulletins to the the treats you give out in the nursery and missions and everything else in between.
Events that church does,
decorations and all that. So of your 13% of people who are giving, and of their 10% of what they are giving, we're looking at 1 to 2% of it is actually going to real effective ministry. Now, if you doubled that and 20% of the people were giving, or if by some fluke everybody just decided to do it God's way and gave 10%. Can you imagine, because the cost of your building aren't going to go up, cost of your staff are not going to go up, all of this money goes directly to ministry. Can you think of how many more missionaries we could send, how many more Bibles we could print, how many more Christian schools we could start, how many more kids we could send into ministry, and
how many counselors you could
you could have engaging in people who are addicted and in crisis. Can you think of all the ministry opportunities that would happen? And as you mentioned before, there was the 10-10-10, and actually there was another that was a festival that was like a third, so 3%.
Yeah, because they had to bring their produce as well.
Yeah. So I mean, at some point it could be as much as 33% a year. But again, a lot of this was doing things that our taxes do, caring for the poor, and these things. But just that 10% that we are investing in kingdom work, eternal work, and then for most of us, let's be honest. Let's be really brutally honest. I don't have enough money to tithe, but most of us have a phone in every single person's hand. And I got to tell you, probably 50-60% of the women I know get their nails done every week. It costs me $25 to get my hair cut once a month. I have cable TV. I have the fastest internet package I can get, and I've been to Disney World way too many times. I'll take a cruise every third year, and I drive a pretty nice car, and I still tithe, and give above my tithe. Now here's the thing. Most of us are not sacrificing by tithing. And in fact, I may be sinning myself, even though I tithe, because there are ways in which I thoughtlessly spend money on things in the face of needs I see, and I make a choice. So I don't think it gets us off the hook by tithing.
Sure.
I think we get right back on the hook by being thoughtless. And so I would agree 100% with you. And by the way, if you are the widow and you're living on Social Security and so forth, if there's a special dispensation where tithing's just not possible, then it would be towards you. Most of the people that make this case are not those people.
Correct. Yeah.
And in fact, some of the most generous people I know are people who are living at or below the poverty line.
Yeah.
And I've literally seen those people empty their wallets for something that the Lord has pressed upon their heart. And I don't believe that a pastor's job is to manipulate and guilt people into giving. I believe that is an expression of God's grace and goodness in our life, where if the Bible tells tells us very clearly that if we cannot give with glad hearts, we ought not give.
Yeah.
That does not mean we don't give. That means we get our hearts right so that we can give with the right motivation.
Yeah, I think ultimately, but what we all agree upon here, debating this issue, and we just have a couple moments left, is that giving must be an act of worship.
Absolutely.
It has to be something that you bring before the Lord, and that. But and I think one of the things that we miss when we don't give is just the amazing blessing. I know that you used to do this back when I was your youth pastor 20 years ago, but you used to challenge people to say, if you give for 6 months, you tithe for 6 months, and if you're not better off financially and spiritually in 6 months, we will write you a check and repay every penny you gave to us. And I think that's a powerful challenge.
And I've been making that challenge for 30 years and never had a person ask me to do it.
No, you haven't. And
I have had people tell me they decided to do it based on the challenge and how the Lord blessed them.
Yeah, and I think that maybe this is another good reminder that, Dan, what I do know is that COVID disrupted so many of the natural rhythms and routines for a lot of people, a lot of disciplines. And I think giving might have been one of those that some people just stopped because of life, and this came up and that came up. You have a crisis moment where if you could put every dollar into something, and then all of a sudden you just get used to doing that. And I think it's a good reminder that all of us at any moment can have a fresh start, to draw a line in the sand and say, you know what, I'm going to get back to this practice. Whether you want to start with 10% or start with grace and say, God, you show me the number, whatever it is. I think both Dan and I would say, make it something by which you are trusting God and making it an act of faith and trust and obedience in your life. So I think we almost covered everything. Dan, I know we could talk another 5 episodes about this with you.
No, I think we've done, and I think it's always good to say this again. We're doing this exercise for the purpose of engaging and poking, and again, we are not your priests, and we all we are is hopefully stimulating each other to good works, and so that's why we always appreciate the fact that you listen to us.
Absolutely. If you have an idea for a debate episode, please sure to let us know, maybe on a Sunday morning when you're at church. Dan and I love these kinds of things, and we look forward to doing this again. So thanks again for joining us on Life Talks. We'll talk to you next time.